And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hope everyone's having a good evening.
Yes, it's marginally warmer here in the polar Ozarks.
I don't know. I'd say it's quite a bit warmer. We're sitting at about 30 degrees warmer than we were 24 hours ago. So
Yeah, yeah, and we're still below freezing.
yes, considerably so.
Oh, winter saved up, and it came to visit all at once.
It did, but and we don't think about it because we only get it about once every 10 years. This intense of a storm, but the Ozarks have a history of harsh winters and um, interesting things to do in the in the
Very.
frozen riverland, actually.
Yes, and that was I love the post that came out with Dark Ozarks this week
Yeah.
about the ice on the river,
Mm-hmm.
and I grew. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's no, I agree. You don't think about it now because if ice forms at all in the Mississippi, it's very rare, but it's because they literally narrowed the channel and deepened it so that it would flow faster, so it wouldn't
Right.
freeze.
Hmm. Although, of course, I come from northern hinterlands, central Illinois,
Uh-huh.
and have crossed the Mississippi more times than I care to count at Burlington and Fort Madison. And a number of times in my life, I have seen the Mississippi frozen across.
Mm-hmm.
It's not certainly not. It has to get sustained cold for that to happen, but it is a little awe-inspiring to see the mighty river um, frozen over. And I grew up on the Illinois River
Mm-hmm.
in Peoria County, and definitely not uncommon to get the ice flows and the big chunks of sheets of ice that then when they break loose they start piling up and making what looks like muddy icebergs.
Well, and I mean, it really is. It's a reminder, sort of icebergs, mini glacier, something like that. It's so cool. But the descriptions around St. Louis are just amazing from the
Yeah.
1800s.
Mm-hmm.
It would freeze 2 to 3 feet thick.
Yeah.
And basically, they turned it into a festival and put down wooden planks and basically had streets and businesses set up in tents, and you could eat, you could shop, you could gamble, basically whatever you wanted. And they would do that literally until the ice started moving.
Yes. Along with the understanding that when it did start to move, you better get off of it.
Yes, that you had to move quickly. My favorite description, though, was that as it started to move, it was so slow that the inexperienced didn't realize it was moving at
Yes.
first. And then, of course, they would go down to the levee and watch it basically destroy all the steamboats.
Yeah. you
Nothing like a little
you do what
winter.
you got to do. It, a Missouri form of gladiatorial combat, really. Uh, Mercantile versus nature.
Well, I believe they said 1857 it took out 17 steamboats at once.
Oh my gosh! And those weren't even the ones that blew up. So
There you go. And you know what? Circling back around, we can start off with blowing up steamboats at the other end of the Missouri now.
well, yes, we can. Yes, we can. Which was a very common experience.
Uh-huh.
Certainly, steamboats did not typically have a long lifespan.
No, usually 3 or 4 years was all they lasted. Usually
Mhm.
because they sank or blew
And
up.
yes, catching on snags,
Yes.
a huge issue, and then or just having their boilers spontaneously combust.
And in the case of the Soldana,
Sometimes with
quite a bit of fanfare. And at Lexington in
yes, yes.
1852, that's what happened with the Soldana. Is the
Mhm.
captain got frustrated because they were caught on snads, had been caught in snads in the river, which the Missouri was renowned for its snads, slowing river boats, and couldn't get around the bend. They were stuck at Lexington for 4 days. So he got tired of it and decided to push the boilers, and the boiler blew, and the poor captain landed 100 feet away from the river on a hilltop, they said. And it was
Oh, yeah, yeah.
it was the most casualties in the Missouri River, they said, from a steamboat. Was well over 100.
Mm. Yeah, it's something that is really pretty chilling when
Oops.
hello.
Hello.
I don't know what happened.
I don't
uh,
know either.
uh, something that's really chilling with the steamboat, with the riverboat accidents, um, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, a high loss of life.
Mhm.
And this was done. These incidents would occur in locations that, if you were looking at it through modern eyes, you'd say that's a safe location. You're
Right.
in many cases within easy swimming distance to the shore. You're not in particularly deep water.
Fast
Oftentimes you're
water.
near a town, and and yet casualty counts could be extremely high, sometimes just for drowning, because
Mhm.
not nearly as many people knew how to swim in many cases, but other times just because of the construction of the riverboat, and if it was a situation of fire or an explosion, uh, being scalded to death, being trapped in wreckage, being thrown vast distances, those types of things. Um, it could be a really, really horrible way to die.
Yes. Well, to give an idea, with the Soldana, it had already sank once before, and it sat on the bottom of the river for 6 months. They salvaged it, rebuilt the boat, and used the same boiler.
Uh,
So
you know,
6 years
that's
old, in the newspapers talked about, basically how ancient it was. I actually saw the word ancient used for it. It was an ancient steamboat because it was 6 years old.
oh, and yeah, very, very fun. So that brings us to Lexington.
Yes.
Lexington is, of course, a very important historical site now,
Hmm.
post Civil War. And the Battle of Lexington took place there in October of 1861, I believe, very
Hmm.
early,
Hmm.
very, very early on.
September, I believe.
Yes.
I believe, yeah. I think the second battle was October the following year, I think.
Okay. Okay. And Lexington, Lexington was really essentially Little Dixie at that time.
It really was. It was the center for hemp plantations on the Missouri. And
Mhm.
hemp was big business for making rope and cloth and
Mhm.
paper. And
Yeah.
so you had a lot of prosperous growers there. Most of them were slaveholders. and a lot of commerce went through there too as a
Yes,
result.
yes. And as you know, the this is, we're talking 1861. So for context, this is still very early in the American Civil War, and a pretty sizable battle actually takes place in which the Missouri State Guard, predominantly, which
Mhm.
was Confederate supporting,
Yes.
uh, essentially won a major battle against the Federal or Union forces, and then ultimately, of course, did not win the state or the war.
Right.
But there's some major things that went on here with Lexington at
Mhm.
this point, and a lot of those centered around the Anderson House.
Yes, the Anderson House was the Orville Anderson home and plantation, and it sits right on the Missouri River. If
Mm.
you look at the post that we put up today, highlighting places for our discussion tonight, you can see the side view of the Anderson House. If you look past it, you see a river, and that's the Missouri River. The river's literally 100 yards from the front door.
Mm.
You can just stand there on the lawn and just watch the water go by. So they watch the steamboats go by and the keel boats and everything. And I have to say, it's one of the places that um, it really has a strong energy about it. And as you're sitting outside on the lawn, you just feel like, I don't want to leave.
And this, the home itself is also associated with a number of paranormal occurrences. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It is renowned for being haunted. The Mr. Anderson built it. His family lived there for quite a long time. Ultimately, later he lost all his money. Eventually, uh, mainly because he kept bailing out his son-in-law from business failings. Um, but eventually a lot of the furniture was sold off and everything, just trying to settle his debts after the war. The
Mm.
war ended up not being kindly to him as far as finances go, and
Yes.
a lot of original items are there. And just to describe it, if you've visited any of the antebellum plantations in the South, the Myrtles down by, Vicksburg, Natchez, so on and so forth, those are the kinds of homes that the Anderson House is. Um, it's very large scale. The main hall has 6 rooms on each floor, for first and second floor, very large rooms. The hallway is probably 20 feet wide, inlaid parquet
Mm.
floor, plaster of medallion moldings, um, just exquisite wood carving, and very grand staircase. And so it definitely makes a statement. And that's not, that's just the main wing. You have a back wing that had basically everything else for the household, and a winter kitchen, and there was a summer kitchen out back. And um, it's a very large home.
Yes.
And people have had experiences there for a very long time, a lot of it I think related to the war, um, some think perhaps related to some of the family members as well. But my own experience was, when we investigated with another team, Elite Paranormal from Kansas City, and we had a docent from the park with us during the investigation. And the docent kept telling us, as we went through the history, that uh, the house had changed hands in the battle 3 times. And in the course of the last exchange, the Union soldiers had grabbed 3 Confederate soldiers and dragged them inside and executed them. And the docent kept saying that they dragged them up to the landing on the second floor and shot them. which one didn't seem to make sense in the context of the battle, and especially as we describe what's going on outside with the bales of hemp and everything. Why would you bother dragging them upstairs? And
Right.
it just didn't make sense to me. But in the main hallway, it was as walk through, particularly the end towards the staircase, I just get almost a swirling tunnel feel, like when you're going through a haunted house and they've got the tunnel that's just kind of that everything moving. Other people had the same sensation. And so afterwards, doing research, found from the original records that the executions did happen at the base of the stairs on the first floor, which made more sense.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
And
But
that it's chilling to think. Of course, I mean, it's a beautiful location. It's very peaceful, but it's a little hard to wrap your head around that level of violence also taking place in the same space.
yes, and then I think did we mention it here or over on Instagram about the dual names of battles? I think we did over there.
Over on Instagram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while the Union referred to this as the First Battle of Lexington, the Confederates referred to it as the Battle of the Hemp Bales. And
yes.
and basically what they did is they ended up surrounding the Union soldiers on the Anderson property by dousing the hemp bales, and they were big round, think of big round hay bales now, dousing them with water and rolling them, as many men as they could get behind them, and rolling them in to basically create almost like a reverse phalanx, Greek phalanx, and just boxing them in while the Union is shooting them and trying to set them on fire. We lost Josh again.
I'm back.
You're back. I'm not sure what you're doing.
I don't know. I'm not doing anything. Weather. North.
So you had all of that. You had all of that going on, and changing control of the house 3 times, and then you had those executions, and it kind of appears they were done out of the frustration of that moment.
Yes.
In other circumstances, they probably would not have happened, and you didn't have senior command staff right there. And so, it's something that probably shouldn't have happened, but it did.
Yeah. What besides the unsettling movement sense, what's your impressions of the home overall from a paranormal perspective, or things that got turned up in the investigation?
There were shadow, lots of shadow movement, shadow men. There were EVPs that male and female voices that I kind of figure are probably more connected to the home itself, not the battle. But and there were probably 12 or 14 investigators total there, and it was interesting. You would have more neutral themes that would come through on audio when the women were around, we were around. And then when a couple of the male investigators went through, they got not quite as friendly responses.
Yeah.
And in fact, the lead investigator for Elite Paranormal basically was told to get the hell out.
Wow.
So
it's so something that you mentioned. I think this might surprise some people. I don't know, but of course the location has these experiences. But you said, and I think we may have just been talking about this privately or offline, but there's a sense there that once you're there, you really don't want to leave.
Yeah, that's how you just, at least for me, I just felt at home, maybe almost a sense of deja vu, but particularly out on the lawn, it was a very calming feeling watching the river, and you just really didn't want to leave that spot. And a couple of other people kind of said the same thing. It was very
Mm,
lulling, almost
yes,
drawing you in just to stay.
I think that's very powerful. That's there are some places that seem to exist in a good way, almost outside of time.
Hmm. And that was how it felt. It was just like, it's that sense of come sit down, have some sweet tea, and have a nice conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. So, of course, all of our stories this week have some sort of connection with the Missouri River.
Hmm.
And
Before we jump ahead, I do want to
yes.
just mention just a little bit something else in the war there, that we end up talking a lot on Dark Ozarks about our outlaws. And of course,
Oh,
Jesse
yeah.
James is one. And something that is connected to Lexington that probably most people don't know is that, um, famously, the James boys didn't surrender after the war, but
Mm,
that's not exactly true. Um, in May of 1865, Jesse rode into Lexington under a white flag to surrender, and the federal troops stationed there fired on him, tried to kill him, and he escaped crawling through brush. And within about a month, the what would become the James Gang was formed,
yes.
and or actually Archie Clements was part of that. And Archie's really kind of interesting. He was one of Quantrell's leader, sort of sergeants that was the most ruthless, and he was very good friends with Jesse James. And he only stood about 5 foot tall, but was sort of the meanest guy in the room.
Hmm.
And so he basically he formed the bank robbing gang and taught the James boys how to rob banks. And so a month after Jesse tried to surrender at Lexington, they robbed their first bank at Liberty.
Yeah.
So if the Union troops hadn't shot on him, we might not have had Jesse James, the legend.
Absolutely. I think that is a very fair assessment, and highlighting, of course, that mid Missouri outlaw and war trail, essentially.
Yeah. And then ironically, it came back around, and Archie, who, by the way, the James brothers' half brother, little half brother, was named after him, and the Pinkertons later killed uh, in an explosion. But
Yes.
Clements came back to Lexington a year after the war and basically tried to electioneer the results of a local election at gunpoint, and the citizens weren't too happy, and they ended up killing him.
Yes. Um, 5 foot tall and a stout 130 pounds.
That's right. And every pound mean, apparently.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So much. I mean, we talk about this a lot, but so much has actually hinged in the Ozarks or within the Ozark borderland regions. And I think it's important to note that Lexington is probably a borderland region, but it's a very, very directly associated with the Ozarks. And of course, the Ozarks itself, the Missouri River is essentially that northern boundary.
Yes. And it's a part of the Ozarks that most people aren't as familiar with.
Yeah,
But
it's still quite rural, with the exception of Jeff City,
yeah.
and very very beautiful. interestingly enough, a lot of the German immigration that took place, and the other half, we had essentially southern plantation culture developing between Jeff City and Kansas City, making it Little Dixie.
Mhm.
But we had a lot of German immigration and settlement following the Napoleonic Wars between Jeff City and St. Louis.
Yes, and a lot of that settlement contributed to the Union soldiers in the Civil War.
Very much so, very very much so, uh, and so interesting, the German immigrants coming, of course, trying to get away from war,
Hmm.
and the devastation of it, but also seeing the ideals of the United States as a bastion of freedom and individual liberty, and they were ready to fight for their adopted nation.
And many, many did.
Hmm. Sometimes before they even learned English.
Well, that was optional. They had more shooting practice. They had more war fighting practice than most of the native troops. So they ended up being very valuable.
Which is quite fair all the way, and develop some amazing culture that you can still participate in.
Mm.
Um, Hashtag winery. Uh,
And you have some stories for us now.
I do. I think we jumped to Herman and then back to Boonville and then finished with St. Charles, and with Jeff City along the way. But that Missouri River country has turned into one of my favorite spots.
Hmm.
And Herman, Missouri is of course, is renowned regionally for its German culture and German architecture, and
Hmm.
had the opportunity in the last year to go um, spend a little bit of downtime there. And I like going to these places initially with no preconception.
Yeah.
Same as the story with Eureka Springs. You go in cold, and if you experience something, you experience it. If you don't, you don't.
Right.
The photos and the bratwurst are so awesome. So that's what it really is all about. And I really fell in love with Herman as a small city. So much of the downtown is original to when the town was founded with the early German immigrant settlers. So neat place. But one of the places got to go in and go to a lot of places, but the Hermanoff Winery,
Hmm.
which is a pretty sprawling establishment at this point, at its base is an original winery structure built in 1848,
Wow.
and it's beautiful. Um, what is particularly fascinating is that the actual structure is over some really cavernous wine cellars that are original, and got to wander in, and it was pretty busy and bustling, and people buying wine and cheese and all that kind of stuff. And there's a sign that just says, self-guided tour, walk down the stairs here. And so I walk down and find myself, of course, in the wine cellars from 1848. They're massive. Um, there are cast iron angels built into the structures,
Interesting.
and very very interesting. And there was absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely a sense of presence
Hmm.
within the space. Um, at the same time, very similar to what you were describing, that I didn't want to leave. It
Yeah.
was very, very, very comforting. There was something about it that kept drawing you into the space and it was like a half hour before closing time, and technically I needed to leave, but I really didn't want to.
Yeah.
Very, very powerful. And at some point in there, because it was a self-guided tour, there was a note that on the wall that said, yes, the place is reported to be haunted, um, by someone who had, fairly early on, I think, had passed in relationship to the space. And I found it really, really fascinating, because I felt that certainly before. I mean, I really don't think that the little wall hanging with the note that says, "Oh, place is haunted,"
Yeah.
uh, would have made that much difference. It very much, there's absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely presence there,
Hmm.
possibly multiple. But again, we often associate hauntings with fear,
Yeah.
and the idea of get out, and of course, a lot of EVP of saying, get out or get the hell
Yeah.
out, or those types of things. And in this case, very much the opposite, just extraordinarily welcoming.
Well, and I find in a lot of places that, particularly, well, not always, but often those sort of calm presences, um, that they don't like the hustle and bustle. And if you've got that busy business going on upstairs, um, a lot of times they will sort of recede into an area where people aren't at a lot, where people
Yeah,
where where people are afraid that, you're going to have a ghost in your face all the time if your house is haunted or something. A lot of times they're like, it's sort of the cliche, but in the attic or in a storeroom or, unused bedroom, that it's like they're just, staying away from you. But when you do go into that space, you definitely sense them.
yeah, yeah. And that's, I think that's, it's such a different reality, is oftentimes so different than expectation.
Very extremely.
It uh, is such a neat reality, though, in oftentimes. And that, interestingly enough, contrasted, I had, and we talked a little bit about this, I had a very unique experience on the Katy Bridge in
Yeah.
Boonville. And then of course, just an interesting experience with the Patty Malone pub in Jeff City. All of these either over the Missouri River, overlooking the Missouri River, or right next to the Missouri River.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, which one do you want to go? I tell you what, go with Patty Malone's first, and then we'll go to the bridge because that segues pretty well into St. Charles.
Into St. Charles, it really does. Um, and Patty Malone's pub is, I believe, at 700 East Main Street or West Main Street, 700 Main Street in Jeff City. You can see the Capitol building from Patty Malone's. It is in one of the oldest buildings in downtown,
Hmm.
and it's been a pub, for an Irish pub, for quite a number of years. Very much a community spot, and it's pretty much a, I don't want to miss getting to go there if I am in Jeff City.
Right.
Food is amazing, and it again is in a very, very old structure, uh, which is obvious the moment that you even lay eyes on it. It's there on the corner. And last time I was in there, the 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 space, again, a lot of these experiences, unlike the Crescent, which there was a very strong sense of malevolence, it a lot of these, for me, again, bear in mind, I'm not going in looking for it.
Right.
And um and of course this could be, anything, of course, if you're particularly skeptical, could be disputed. But then I'm just going, what is my experience, and how,
Exactly.
what is, what sort of sense do I have of this space? And I really love the building. It's incredible. What was funny, of course, was eating my meal. There's of course the long side that's the restaurant, and then
Yeah.
on the other side is, under other circumstances, more of a space for music and that sort of thing. And so partway through my meal, I need to go to the bathroom, TMI. But I the bathrooms are on the other side, and there's
Mhm.
nobody over there.
Right.
And I go over there, and two things. One, in the bathroom space, which of course wouldn't have been the bathroom for
Right.
much of the building's history, there was just the sense that there was somebody there. They didn't seem to be surprised by me. I didn't really feel terribly surprised by them. I couldn't tell exactly where they were at, but I also had the distinct sense that they would appreciate it if I was polite to them. And but there was just a fairly warm, welcoming, but existent sense of presence within that space, which was a little odd. And the other, to get there, is the staircase up to the second floor. This was probably about 7 o'clock at night. It was dark. The stairwell is closed for public access, and it was unlit. But beyond the sense of being unlit, there was a really strong sense of foreboding at the top of the stairs.
There are places like that. I mean, when you said that, it made me think of the stairs to go into the green room at the Coleman.
Very fair. Very, very fair. And it's something, again, we generally recognize some of paranormal activity being associated with sentience
Hmm.
and energy that can move. And
Hmm.
so, and like you mentioned, there is at times, sometimes in these spaces there's a malevolent anger, but other times there is a shyness, and then
Yes.
sometimes foreboding, and it can be a lot of different things. I think, you know it's interesting sometimes, if you were to go barging in seeking something, you might find nothing,
Hmm.
but then when you stop looking for it, it's back.
That's my experience in a lot of situations. If you go in bold and it's almost it's human nature. Go in bold. I'm looking for this, and where are you? Well, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna show myself to you.
No. And I wonder, obviously, as corporeal beings, we experience shyness.
Hmm.
I wonder how much of that transitions or transfers through.
Oh, I think so. You see that personality aspects of personality definitely show through, and at different
Mhm.
places that it can be playful, it can be shy, it can be bold, can be overconfident, just like people are have various personalities.
Very much so, yeah. Which is so interesting, just in the entire process. I can tell you, it was probably, in retrospect, it was particularly interesting at Patty's. Um, on one hand, the sense of someone in around the corner in the bathroom space,
Mm-hmm.
um, very, very not a concern.
Mm-hmm.
Not a concern, not a sense of I need to get out, or I need not to be here, or any of that. But at the same time, had it been appropriate to walk up those stairs, whether the light was on or not, I would prefer not to.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just best to go with that feeling. And I think, to give people an idea, when you say, it's in one of the oldest buildings downtown, it is a fairly old place for Missouri. I mean, 1820s,
It is.
starting to be built.
Yeah. Yes. they were, and of course we talked about that with the penitentiary.
Hmm.
Um, that there are structures in Jeff City that really would be classified as old within the time frame of the nation, not
Hmm.
just the time frame of the West.
Right, right. That, they are old enough to fall in that category there, and in St. Charles and St. Louis, particularly, and a couple other places. But um, so
Yes,
when you say, this building is old, it's close to 200 years old, probably.
we're pushing in that direction, and but again, it's so beautiful. I love the fact it is still in use, and and quite frankly, if you're looking for a fantastic Irish pub,
It's just a good one
and
anyway.
they have, I know, and I would imagine that they have no idea I even exist. So, in terms of like giving them advertisement, but I
Right.
just really like a good Irish pub.
Well, nothing wrong with that. I do too.
And
So
some of the some of the best beer cheese soup I have ever had, I had at Patty Malone's. Oh my
there you
gosh! So that was fun. Of course, on the same trip, had a really interesting experience on what actually is the old Katy Trail Railroad Bridge in Boonville.
go. And Boonville's not too far
And
from Jeff City either.
no, it is not. It's on up the way. Um, Very, very interesting town. Very interesting history. Of course, a river town, and the old railroad bridge. And what I think is funny is it's actually the new railroad bridge. It was finished in 1931/1932.
Yeah. Well, it's probably one of the first railroad bridges over the Missouri.
I suspect so, and of course, just a lot of history. There's a beautiful old restored um, mission style Katy Trail depot there,
Oh, cool.
and the bridge itself and part of the trail is kind of obscured by the big casino that's all there now. But I think there's just for a little bit of understanding. If I want to get good pictures of stuff, and several people who know me will attest to this, I become irritatingly fearless about location. Uh, I know uh, several times round spring ask around about my photographing at round spring, because I'm like hanging off the side of the 30-foot cliff because I really want this angle, and I'm like, and it's weird once I'm trying to get photos, things like heights and snakes and all those things that I would normally be concerned about, it turns off in my brain, and I just try to get there. So um the Katy Trail Bridge, built in 1930, completed in 1932, is closed. It's no longer a working railroad bridge,
Right.
but a portion of it is, you can walk out over the river on it. It crosses the existing um, railroad track that runs along the Missouri in the east to west route, and then it goes out over the river. And it's very, very neat. It's very evocative. The It was one of those bridges that had the big pulley and weight system that would raise
Oh,
um, a portion of the bed up to let river traffic through.
cool.
And those that the essentially the gate houses and the pulleys and the gates and all of that are all still there, and you can walk
Oh,
out
yeah.
to it. And I walk out over the first portion of the bridge, which is over the railroad tracks and still a long ways up. and get a great shot of the sunset up around the bend with the bluff, and him kind of hanging over the edge, looking at the railroad and all that stuff. And then I go ahead and walk out to the portion over the river.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess also important to understand, I love bridges. I spent my entire childhood, we were traversing over massive river bridges near my hometown. Every time we went to my grandparents, I love the old bridge at Burlington, specifically because
Yeah.
it had the wire, essentially a heavy wire mesh floor that you could look down to the river.
Yeah.
uh, and I always loved it when somebody was riding with us, it would like completely freak out, because I thought it was the coolest thing ever that we were on a bridge that you could see the river underneath your vehicle. Those types of things. I when we were down south in Louisiana, I would specifically ask my dad that we would detour on I-10 over to New Orleans, not to go to New Orleans, but just so we could drive on Lake Pontchartrain, go across the Pontchartrain Bridge. I,
Nice.
one of my highlights, one of my highlights to the Eastern Seaboard was that we got to do the Delmar Tunnel, the Chesapeake tunnel that goes under
Yeah.
between the Delaware Peninsula and Virginia Beach. All of that. I say all that to say I'm not afraid of bridges, and I'm not afraid of being over rivers.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of yards out past the railroad bridge, I don't even realize what's happening, but I become incredibly agitated. I become really paranoid that I'm going to drop my phone, that I need to now be holding onto the phone with two hands, that I probably should have my phone in my pocket. And the further I get out toward the guardhouses and the gates and everything, the more it is impressed upon me that if I'm even going to be in this space, I need to be in the center of the trail, the center of the bridge, and as far away from the edges as possible. Otherwise, this intense agitation and sense that my phone's going to end up in the river, or I'm going to end up going over the edge. I am in danger. I should not be there. And just this incredible sense of discomfort that this is not a place, this is not a space that I'm supposed to be in. I do manage to get out far enough to get some pictures, but it literally, I find myself standing in what really is a very wide space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a long way from falling off of anything,
Right.
and I'm going, I cannot get any closer to the edge.
Hmm. Interesting.
I have no idea why, but very odd.
It sounds like something probably happened there at some point.
And I mean, it essentially, I mean, it was built 90 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
the structure itself, but that of course is not counting the fact that there was a bridge there prior,
Right.
and then of course a lot of river traffic as well.
And who knows what all happened, if there how many, boats went down right there, or who knows.
It was very fascinating to me. It's one of those things. If it wasn't for something like a platform like Dark Ozarks, uh, I probably wouldn't even talk about it.
Yeah. Well, there you
It's
go. But it's an
yeah,
interesting experience, and other people have those experiences in places.
yes, and I think it's one of the things that I think is important. We, I and of course the tagline of Dark Ozarks is sometimes there are no easy answers. Right at the moment, there's certainly no easy answers for me. I
Right.
just know what I felt.
And sometimes I know what I saw, or I know what I felt has to be enough.
Yeah, yeah, and you document it, you respect it. You don't let it overwhelm you,
Right.
but you just catalog that and move on. But if anybody is watching that has had a similar experience, I'd love to hear from folks.
Yeah.
And if anybody has some additional history on the old Katy Bridge in Boonville, or anything that might have happened in that, it would be really interesting. I'd love to compare notes.
Yeah, I would too. I'd love to know because I just have a feeling that something has happened there that in the right, with that information, you're probably going, oh, okay, that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, it was such a strong sense of agitation and a sense of impending danger that one that you couldn't really, obviously, I looked around, it was a beautiful evening, there wasn't anything that was physically putting me in danger,
Right.
but a sense, an impression, I think would be the right word for it, an impression of danger, or an echo of danger, something very out of place. And I'd managed to hike around a lot, the whole area there in
Uh-huh.
downtown, and it was definitely the only place that I felt that.
Well, that's another story to explore.
It is. But speaking of bridges, we have a
Exactly.
we have a voodoo witch.
Well, we have a voodoo witch, and definitely a bridge story, all rolled into one.
Yes, in of all places, St. Charles, Missouri.
St. Charles, Missouri. Um, Now, I guess one thing to think about is that aside from St. Louis, it's the oldest town in Missouri,
Yes.
and it has a lot of French influence early on.
Hmm.
And this story, though, didn't really kick up steam until the mid 20th century. And
Right.
it's probably one of the more infamous urban legends in Missouri, and that is the voodoo witch of St. Charles. And we know who she was. We've always known her name. Her name was Molly Crenshaw. And the legend grew that she was a Jamaican born African American, probably slave, voodoo priestess
Yes.
who, somewhere in the 1820s or 30s, um, started basically frightening the community. Uh, they were afraid of her, and it's not clear what supposedly happened for them to be in fear or why she might have a vendetta. But basically, the story goes that to preempt, sort of demise of the town, they killed her, and not only killed her, they um, quartered her,
Yes.
cut her into pieces, and buried them in various places so that her body could not reassemble.
Yes. Mm.
So you have a lot of detail there. Um, now the flip side is we do know who Molly Crenshaw was, and
Yeah.
she didn't live in the 1820s. She died in 1913, a 52-year-old school teacher who did take her own life by drinking carbolic acid. Um, which, by the way, carbolic acid it's kind of like when we joke about SIDS people in the 19th century. Carbolic acid in the early 20th century was the go-to means of suicide, which is kind of ironic because it would be, it's very caustic, and it's a very painful, not quick death. But
Yes.
she, and no one knows why she committed suicide, but she did, and she was found at home
Hmm.
and buried in the cemetery, which now is known as the Witch Cemetery. And um, somewhere between her death and the 1960s, the legend of the voodoo priestess arose and somehow got tied around Molly Crenshaw's tombstone.
Wow.
However, there is a little macabre twist in that in the 60s, as the legend grew, teenagers would go out to the cemetery to try to communicate with Molly Crenshaw, etc. And at some point, supposedly, a teenage girl is out there, and a couple of teenage boys decide they're going to scare her and make her think that Molly Crenshaw has risen from the grave and is chasing her. Unfortunately, what then happened is the young girl ran out of the cemetery to the river, out onto the railroad bridge, and jumped over the edge.
Wow.
At least that's that is the story. Now, whether that is the real reason she did, we don't know. But
right. Oh, there's a lot of moving parts to this, including almost the conflation of history with a real tragedy combined with an urban legend resulting in a tragedy.
yes, and then beyond that, that of course kicked to the urban legend up further, and so you had more pilgrimages out to the cemetery, and people trying to chip off pieces of the tombstone as souvenirs, things like that. So they actually then removed her tombstone and moved it to a private home where it has stayed since, so that it's not vandalized.
Yes.
And on the promo for tonight, that's on there. The picture that has the stone, it has a picture of the house where it's kept. So now her grave is unmarked.
Yes. Oh, now I've been to St. Charles.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been once. I want to go back. I find it incredibly fascinating and beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Small city, and I'd be very interested to dig more into this. Of course, St. Charles has, in addition to being the second oldest city, obviously has a strong French connection and a strong river connection. And you put those two together, it doesn't take a lot to connect it with New Orleans, to connect it with potentially Haiti, so on and so forth.
And
So
potentially Jamaica and so on and so forth. Yeah. And
So
that's where I'm sure that it developed. Although, to be perfectly honest, it has quite a few details that normally these urban legends that kind of spring up out of nowhere are more vague. This has quite a few details to it. So there definitely was a narrative that's was going for this some when it was created, and it may, and no one knows why it was associated with Molly. My guess was probably someone's in the middle of the cemetery telling a good story, and this is her.
right. So interesting though. I'd love to do some more research and wonder if the lore that got attached to the school teacher was not actually pre-existent with an older origin.
Well, so everything that I've found kind of indicates that everyone thinks that it really did. The story started in the mid 20th century.
Wow.
And decades after she had died, and that it didn't pre-exist, or at least I haven't found anything, which I find kind of odd too, because voodoo is not an isolated practice in Missouri either. I mean, it's not that
No.
uncommon, particularly in the 1800s.
Yes.
So it would not surprise me if there weren't a similar story that uh, it comes from, maybe not from here, but a similar story that happened somewhere, and in retelling it here, it got connected to the place.
Yeah,
I wonder
yeah.
that.
I would be very curious about that as well. And I think the thing that is interesting is the specificity of the legend.
Yes, yes. Um, I mean, it really has a New Orleans feel to it.
Hmm. It does. It does. There's also an interesting element of um dark magic a little bit out of place
Yes,
in
yes.
the sense that in something that I feel is in certainly in New Orleans, Haiti, etc., that voodoo practice tends to not get you quartered.
Yes, well, and the legends tend to be more that the practitioner is more powerful, that
Right.
that could not have been defeated in this way.
Hmm.
This, I mean, it has sort of that element, but it also has sort of a New England witch hunt feel to it as
Yes,
well.
it does. Yes, it does. And and the essence, and I think this is an interesting um sort of cross purposes. You can't win for losing
Hmm.
um process. We know that, of course, there were many threads of hoodoo. We're going to jump over to hoodoo for a moment and
Uh-huh.
root work. Many threads of hoodoo. There's certainly a strong European component. There's or old world component. Sort of a strong American settler backwoods combined with Native American practice
Yeah.
component, and then a very strong African American component to hoodoo. And
Mhm.
the thing that was something that was very attractive, I think, about any of those elements of hoodoo was that it provided a sense of at least attempted justice for um, marginalized peoples,
Mhm.
regardless of their origin,
Right.
whether they were poor white settlers in the mountains, whether they were um, African Americans, whether they were Native Americans, or in some cases, whether they were Old World immigrants
Mhm.
from places like Italy or Germany. That there was a sense that if you were poor and marginalized in terms of the social strata, and that you would not necessarily get justice through standard means, that root work had a great deal of attraction to it because you could appeal to justice through your own ways.
Right.
At the same time, it might get you tried and convicted for for witchcraft.
Yes, especially depending on the time period. Something
Yeah.
else that kind of came to mind, though, and especially since the legend pins her very early in the history, the 1820s to 30s in the legend. Um, Something else that happened roughly in that time period that was in New England was the New England vampire scare,
Yeah.
um, which no one really knows why, but there were a, a number of New England towns in the 1820s and 30s that became very paranoid that they had vampires among their midst,
Yes.
and that those that died that were suspected of being vampires, that they pinned them to their graves, etc., in ways that later would become more cliche with Bram Stoker, etc., but did occur in that time period. And so the quartering and the burying in various places, it has that kind of feel to it, not letting
Yeah.
anything come back.
Yes, I do agree. And something, of course, that our series of 20th century vampires have given us, pop culture vampires, uh, which have ranged from uh, stoically seductive to incredibly twinkly. That we're not talking about those kind of vampires. Think more in terms of vampiric revenants or vampiric ghouls.
Yes.
That with the added horror factor that it's coming back in the form of a loved one.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it does make you wonder why those details in the supposed time frame, but it's either a completely modern invention or it's building on something uh, orally in the past that my guess did happen somewhere else, either the vampire scare or something
Yes,
else.
yes, and we don't know what that is. Of course, I want to do more research. I find St. Charles to be an incredibly beautiful and um, alluringly fascinating place that I
Mhm.
know you don't have to you would not have to dig very deep there to start uncovering all sorts of very, very interesting history and lore.
Exactly. And that's something that we may have to delve into deeper, but um, it certainly does give us a bookend to our river stories, and unfortunately, a very tragic ending, uh,
Very, very true. Very,
you
very
know,
true.
with the railroad bridge,
Yes.
um, which has since been demolished, apparently.
Right. And for folks that might not be familiar with the geography, St. Charles is right on the river.
Hmm. Literally, yeah, it was a river town. Well, in
Yes.
fact, Lewis and Clark, we tend to think of Lewis and Clark leaving from St. Louis on their expedition, but they actually left from St. Charles.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. St. Charles was, I guess, for a few years there, St. Charles was not only a river town in Missouri, it was the river town in Missouri.
Pretty much, it was that final jumping off place, kind of like the spur on the railroad that only went 12 miles out of town and went nowhere else. That
Oh
half
yeah.
mile out of St. Louis.
Hmm. Almost to Merrimack, but not
Almost.
quite.
The
Oh my gosh. Well, I think
round trip
that's
that you enjoy.
no doubt. Oh my gosh. Yeah, this is jumping. But I remember one record I think would be interesting to look into. I believe the federal prisoner of war camp in Rolla is located about where the Walmart Supercenter is today.
Why is that so just, ironically appropriate? Because I feel like a prisoner when I'm in Walmart.
Oh
Not
my
making
god.
light, but
Oh yeah, yeah. I think there's some sort of cyclical resonance in the universe with that, as well as the bridges.
it would be interesting to know if odd things happen there, that's for sure.
It certainly would. It certainly would. If there's anybody that's had a Confederate apparition in the garden section, we'd like to know it.
Exactly. It's kind of funny that people always think of, places that are haunted as like an old building like Patty Malone's or the Anderson House, or, a Victorian house, Victorian, that fits the picture. But
Mhm.
There are a lot of haunted businesses that are modern buildings
Yes.
that people go in every day and they have no idea. But for people like me, because often I'm wearing a team jacket or t-shirt a lot, and you'd be surprised how many places you go to eat or you go to shop, and I've been told, you know what, you know what, happens here, you know, and
Mhm.
and people would be surprised that, yeah, it's just not
Yes.
that idea of the lady in white in a castle or the Victorian or whatever. It's, it can be Walmart or Hardee's or the grocery store or whatever.
It is so true. And one of the things that I think certainly a personal goal for for me, and I think it's a collective goal for Dark Ozarks, is encouraging people that it's okay to talk about these stories.
Yes. Yes. One thing that I've really enjoyed over time with what I do with Paranormal Science Lab is being able to for people to do that. And I've had that experience a number of times where, it's just that, can I tell you a story? Can I tell you what happened? And
Yes.
they that it's okay, and and that you shouldn't have to be able to tell your story and people look at you like you just grew a you know third
Yes.
second and third head or something. uh,
I know. And I've had very similar experiences where in the course of the conversation, if they know that I, write about these things or respectfully research these things, and then they go, well, I've had this experience,
mhm.
and it's one of, to me it's a little heartbreaking in the sense that, it's very, human beings are we're herd mammals. We're created to share, we're created to interact. And it's very, I think it's very, very isolating to have an experience that you don't feel like you can talk about.
Well, yes, because it and often they're not scary or anything else. It shouldn't be something that they have to be afraid to to share. It's not, you know most of the time they're not kind of experiences like, I went, like the Exorcist story that we talked about
Right.
last week,
No.
it's, I just had this experience, and, they may feel a little uneasy, or they may have felt uh, calm, or perhaps even satisfied, message from a loved one or something. And those are things that people should be able to share and not feel badly about.
Hmm.
And the other people shouldn't judge people. We
No.
tend to judge others very quickly for having any experiences that are different than us.
Yes, and I think one of the things that is particularly sad about that is that most individuals who do have these experiences didn't go looking for them, were not expecting them, didn't
Exactly.
ask for them, and in many cases were skeptics themselves prior.
Well, to be perfectly honest, mo- most people tend to be skeptics, or at least neutral, until they have an experience. So,
Yes, yes. So I guess all that to be said, anytime that someone feels comfortable sharing stories with us, either in person or through direct messaging or online, we appreciate that and we respect it.
we do, and they're held in confidence, unless you are comfortable with something being shared. So,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that's we covered a lot of territory tonight.
literally.
All the way across the state, and my goodness, if of course ghost stories from anywhere are awesome, but if you have a particular haunting experience or lore in association with the Missouri River Valley in mid Missouri, the northern ragged edge of the Ozarks, we'd love to hear that as well.
Definitely, definitely. And we continue to get stories from people. We got one online today, and a very interesting one, and that I hadn't heard before. So, you know, it's just, I'm glad that this is becoming a group project in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we couldn't do it without y'all. And it's pretty fun.
It is. It is. And we will be back next Wednesday and hope everyone stays safe and warm in between.
Very much so. Yes. Be careful, y'all. Have an awesome evening. Lisa, appreciate you so much.
Appreciate you, Josh. And we will figure out what we're going to talk about next week then.
Sounds good.
Night all.
Night.